Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our CEN seminar series. We have a super interesting talk this afternoon, which is titled Mobile Eye Tracking as a Window on Inequity in Children's Language Development Opportunities. Super duper interested to hear about this. So our speaker is Thibaut Duthois. Thibaut is a Belgian doctoral researcher at Ghent University. He's working on educational inequality and teacher professionalization under the supervision of Professors Ruben van der Lind, Maribel Montero Perez, and Piet van Avermaet. His main research interest lies in early childhood education with a particular focus on uncovering the mechanisms of inequality at the teacher level, which is super interesting. And to this end, he employs mobile eye tracking technology to study the teacher's visual attention and interaction patterns in the classroom. Very applied, very interesting, and I will hand over to Thibaut to tell us more.
All right. Hi. Um, Very glad to be here. Very honored to present here at your seminar. It's true. I'm Thibaut. I'm from Ghent University, and I do a PhD at the intersection of educational studies and of linguistics. And I called my presentation "What Children Get Overlooked: How to Create a Language Stimulating Environment for Every Child." And as you can see from that image, I did use mobile eye tracking to study the attentional distribution over individual children. But maybe allow me to begin by explaining why I started this PhD. I've always been quite driven by a sense of social justice and especially about creating equal opportunities in educational settings. And then the language development of children is particularly a very interesting topic. Because if there is one place where inequality in our educational system begins or might even be reinforced, then it is surely in the language development and language stimulation of children. And then there's one famous study that I want to show you. It was carried out 10 years before I was born. Then two American researchers, Betty Hart and Todd Risley, filmed children in 42 families for over a total of 1,300 hours. And then I start imagining this research with very huge cameras, with large videotapes, much more difficult than the kind of research we do nowadays. But they did videotape these children. And of course, they didn't only videotape the children, they could also hear the language that was used around these children and the language these children heard during this crucial phase in their language development. And so in those recordings, they counted every word that was being used. And those children weren't used randomly. Some grew up in welfare families, which means they lived in households that lived on benefits, on social support. Some were of working class families and some children of high socioeconomic backgrounds. And when they did count the words in those videotapes, they discovered a remarkable difference between these three types of families. With numbers of words captured in those 1,300 hours, then they performed some mathematical hocus pocus, we call it in Dutch. They did some difficult mathematical things to then know how much words these children should hear within the first 3 years of their lives. And then maybe you've heard about the 30 million word gap. This line of research led to this striking conclusion. Across the first 3 years of life, children might hear up to 30 million words more or fewer, depending on their socioeconomic backgrounds. This idea, the so-called 30 million word gap, became very famous and has been revisited several times. I have to tell you that it didn't reproduce every single time, but I believe that the most methodologically robust attempt came in 2017 from Gilkerson and colleagues who used automated language assessment technology to answer the same research question. How many words does a child hear? And they found, based on socioeconomic background again, a 3,000 difference word count per day, which would translate into a 4 million word gap within the first 3 years. So why did I tell you this? What can we say with confidence? That there is a substantial inequality that is deeply embedded in the children's early language environments. In other words, where your cradle stands, where you grow up, the circumstances you are born into strongly shapes how much language you are exposed to from the very beginning. But you are all either educational scientists or even work within education, teachers. So if you hear inequality at home, your mind goes to the same place my mind does. So you might think, okay, inequality at home, that gives us opportunities for our education to make a difference. So let's talk about language development within education. What can we as educational professionals do? And we know that language stimulating interactions is a powerful tool in tackling this inequality. So we know that language development of children is a very complex intersectional process with a lot of variables that can influence it, which makes it kind of surprising that when we look at previous research about what classroom factors can influence language learning outcomes, and then I'm talking about big meta reviews that have been published on this question, it's kind of surprising that the answer to that question is pretty straightforward, which is, I believe, pretty uncommon within education sciences to have like a consensus or a straightforward answer. But the answer that we keep on finding is that language stimulating teacher-child interactions are crucial for stimulating the language development of children. And what is a language stimulating interaction? It is an interaction between one child and one teacher that consists out of three basic ingredients. First, children need to receive rich, tailored language input. So a teacher needs to use a lot of words, a lot of sentences, complex sentences, rich sentences when they are speaking to a child. Second, a child also needs opportunities for language production. So a child needs the opportunity to use the language he or she has heard from his teachers or parents. And third, when a child did slowly try to say something, a child needs feedback from their teacher. This is a cyclical process of teacher input, child output, and feedback that can best be realized within interactions between a teacher and a child. So in Flanders, we have a pretty rich field of observational research in early childhood education. There have been quite a lot of researchers that took video cameras within the early childhood classroom. And we saw that the opportunities within the classroom environment are not always used fully. So first of all, we've seen in previous observational research that the quantity of interactions in early childhood classrooms remains somewhat insufficient. We have observed quite a lot of waiting time. So when children are standing in line, when children are waiting on the playground to go to their classroom, this often happens in silence, which is a pity because also these moments could be used to have those very important teacher-child interactions. And in general, we observed little opportunities for conversation within the classroom. You can see a newspaper article there. Of course, it's in Dutch, so you might not understand, but it says that some children in their early childhood classroom only got 10 seconds of interaction time with their teacher per day, which really, shook us as educational researchers and as educational practitioners when we read this in the newspaper. Secondly, also the quality of interactions remained pretty insufficient. We found that when teachers interacted with children, they often used short sentences, closed questions, directive utterances, which doesn't represent the rich, complex syntax and vocabulary that a child needs as a starting point for this language development cycle. And then what we are starting to find, and what really is at the heart of my research, is how are these interaction opportunities distributed over children? Does every child receive the same opportunities to interact with their teacher? But what is striking when we are talking about interaction quality in a classroom is that when you talk to teachers, they do know these three key ingredients of language stimulation. And they are, of course, aware of how important these teacher-child interactions are. So the real issue here cannot simply be a lack of knowledge. There has to be another question that we need to address. And to explore that question, I turned to literature on teacher education, on teacher professional development, and eventually came to the Blumekes competence model that you can see there. In this model, competence is understood as a continuum. On the one end, we have teachers' dispositions. So, for example, their knowledge or their pedagogical beliefs they possess. In this case, that includes believing in the importance of those teacher-child interactions. And on the other end of the continuum, you have teachers' actual behavior, which in this case would represent asking open questions, giving language feedback, inviting children into conversation, and so on. What this model claims is that these two ends, so this knowledge part and this behavior part, is connected to each other by a set of situation-specific skills. So there are skills that can only be applied in a complex real-world classroom situation. And these skills are often described as teachers' professional vision. And they include two key components, noticing and reasoning. So in essence, what do teachers see in a classroom? And how do they interpret and reflect on what they saw? So in my doctoral research, the key question is not simply what are teachers doing? It's not even what do they know about language development? The deeper question is what do they see? What do they notice? Do they see the opportunities for language support? And do they apply these skills intentionally? And especially, do they apply these skills with every child? Do they see every child when they are realizing interaction in the classroom? So the research that I will take you through today will really focus on the middle part of the model, namely on teachers' situation-specific skills, on teachers' professional vision. And so we did that by employing mobile eye tracking. So for this study, I equipped ECE teachers with mobile eye tracking glasses. These are lightweight glasses with a small outward-facing camera that records exactly what the teacher sees and has sensors in the glasses, in the lenses of the glasses that register every eye movement. And as you can see, these glasses are much more used in marketing research, for example. Here in the example on the slide, you can see that companies use them to find out where a consumer looks when they walk through a store. And of course, I don't have to tell you that they later on use this information to put the most expensive stuff just right where we watch in a store. Now, the good thing, the big advantage of doing this research in the supermarket is that the shelves that you want to do research on, that they do not move. And in a preschool classroom, however, everything moves. Children, teachers, material, the whole learning environment, which makes mobile eye tracking technically far more challenging within early childhood education. And that is also why this method is still extremely rare in early childhood education. I think, for what I do know now, worldwide, only 3 research groups, one in Finland, me in Belgium, and one in Japan, are using mobile eye tracking in early childhood education. So why did I choose this methodology, knowing that it would be extremely challenging from a methodological point of view? Well, because it gives me the enormous privilege of seeing the classroom through early childhood teachers' eyes. And I truly believe that there is no place where this is more important and more fascinating than in early childhood education. Let me explain why. In later stages of education, it is relatively easy to create learning opportunities uniformly. And with that, I mean for every child at the same time in the same way. Teachers can distribute what I call didactic capital equally across all students. For example, all of you are now receiving this presentation and what I am saying in the same way at the same time and under the same conditions. Or, for example, a secondary school teacher who teaches chemistry, if he or she arrives 5 minutes early, they can set up the same experiment on every desk and make sure that every student gets the same learning opportunity in the same way at the same time. Well, in early childhood education, that is completely different. There are no PowerPoint slides like mine. There are no handouts, no books. There is far less direct instruction that goes on with every child at the same time in the same way. We know that learning opportunities emerge from a long chain of small moment-to-moment decisions made by the teacher. Who is allowed to play in which corner of the classroom? Which child is going to play with cars in one corner of the classroom? And what child am I going to take with me to read a book in the book corner? And then what will I say? Who will I talk to? What feedback will I give? It is in those one-on-one spontaneous interactions, each the result of dozens of tiny decisions, that are incredibly meaningful for children's learning. We know that from research. Those spontaneous one-on-one interactions between a teacher and a child, it is very important. But at the same time, these small decisions also create many opportunities for mechanisms of inequality. Because who is keeping track? Is it always the same child who gets the open-ended questions, who gets the rich feedback? Or on a larger scale, is it always the same child who is allowed to play with the cars in the corner where not much of linguistic input is present? And is it always the same child who goes to the book corner, for example? So that is why looking through the teacher's eyes and understanding what they see, and maybe more importantly, what they do not see, that is absolutely interesting and central to my research. And also from a linguistic point of view, as we know that these one-on-one interactions shape language development of children, then this is a question where language researchers are really thinking about who is engaged within one-on-one interactions and who is not. How is direct language input and indirect language input distributed across children? But this is an extraordinarily difficult question for researchers to answer because it requires knowing for every single utterance a teacher produces. It requires knowing exactly which child it was directed to, which is almost impossible. But with those glasses, with mobile eye tracking, we can reformulate this question to what children are being visually engaged, looked at during these teacher-child interactions. And this question is at the heart of my research. So today I would like to walk you through the main 4 research questions of my doctoral research. We did mobile eye tracking with that data. We did multimodal conversation analysis, and we also used stimulated recall interviews to let teachers look through their own eyes and research their reflections. To answer 4 research questions: how is preschool teachers' attention distributed? Which child-related variables predict teachers' attention? Or in other words, what children are looked at a lot and what children are overlooked? What role does teachers' gaze play in the distribution of learning opportunities? And which barriers do preschool teachers encounter in stimulating each child's language development? Therefore, we incorporated 80 teachers within our research, over 500 children, and we investigated more than 2,000 minutes of mobile eye tracking recordings. So let me start with the first 2 research questions, mainly how does the attentional distribution of teachers look like? And what did we find? We found that teachers' attention is not evenly distributed over children. Not every child is seen in the same way in his or her early childhood classroom. And to be honest, we more or less expected that. From earlier international studies in both primary and secondary education, we already knew that a perfectly even distribution of attention is not realistic. We collected a total of 20 minutes of data in a 1:5 setting for every child. And I don't have to tell you that a 1:5 setting is a very luxurious ratio for young children. Here in Flanders, on average, we can say that in early childhood education, from the early age of 3 years old onwards, the average ratio is 1:25. So being in an activity where you have to share your teacher only with 4 other children is a very luxurious setting for the children in our study. But even within that luxurious setting, the differences that we could observe were pretty striking. In those 20 minutes per child, for the one child, this equaled more than 10 minutes of direct visual attention. And from conversation analysis, we know that this also means one-on-one interactions with your teacher. And for other children in our data set, the total amount of visual attention was only a few seconds, only being looked at a few seconds. Now, it's important to be clear about one thing. A perfectly equal distribution of attention is never an end on itself. It's not the goal of our research. We do not expect teachers to behave like robots, giving every child exactly 4 minutes of attention. In fact, teachers often may have good reasons to spend more time with a particular child, to monitor their well-being, to support learning, or simply for classroom management, I can imagine. But what would be problematic, what would be worrisome, is that if we, across the more than 500 children in our data set, we would find systemic statistical patterns between who these children are, their children characteristics, and the amount of attention they receive. Because that would mean, if we find statistical correlations, that I, as a researcher, before a child even enters a classroom, could predict on the basis of who this child is, if he or she would be looked at a lot or would be looked at very little. And spoiler alert, we did find statistical significant relationships between children's characteristics and the amount of attention they received. And we found them for 3 characteristics: speaking confidence, linguistic background, and language development. If a teacher perceived a child as having low speaking confidence, that child was likely to receive less visual attention. If a child spoke a language other than the school language at home, again, that child tended to receive less attention. And if a teacher's expectations of the child's language development was lower, they were also likely to receive less attention. Now, speaking confidence may sound very intuitive. Confident, talkative children with a big mouth naturally attract more attention because they are simply speaking. But nonetheless, I think this finding is very important because in research and in policy and in conversations about educational inequality, we talk a lot about language development. We talk a lot about home languages, about linguistic background, multilingual children. But how often do we talk about quiet children? How often do we see speaking confidence as an important factor within educational inequality? I think they're often described as the quiet ones, maybe the easy ones, the well-behaved ones, the children who don't cause any trouble. But our research showed that their speaking confidence had the strongest association with the classroom dynamics and with the interaction opportunities a child receives. So I want to already take you through the most important conclusions so far. Our research learned us that linguistically vulnerable children are at risk of being overlooked in their preschool classroom. In today's early childhood education, 20 minutes with the teacher may constitute a source of direct language-stimulating interactions for one child, while offering little more than the opportunity for just overhearing a conversation for another child. And inequality is not only determined by linguistic proficiency or your multilingual background, but also whether you as a child dare to use those languages. Now, I can already hear you think, Thibaut, doesn't the teacher just look at the child who starts speaking? Isn't that normal? Isn't that maybe not just polite to look at the child who is speaking? And it's good that teachers have these critical questions, because these critical questions, they stimulate us researchers to dig deeper into our data, which is why I then started to research this new research question: what role does teachers' gaze play in the distribution of learning opportunities? So what did we do? We did a multimodal conversation analysis. We coded every fixation per fixation, to know who is being looked at. We coded every utterance, everything a teacher said, what is being said. And we coded the sequences during conversational turns. So every time someone new started speaking, a child or the teacher, and we investigated on the basis of the eye gaze and of the basis of the utterances, why did someone started speaking? Which created this very rich multimodal data set that we used to answer this question. And I'm going to do this research together with you guys, because I brought 3 situations. A teacher looks up from reading material, a teacher addresses the whole group, and a teacher asks an open-ended question. And together we're going to follow the teacher's gaze and analyze what happens. Now, it's important to know I brought 5 children, and 2 of them are what I call linguistically proficient. And I'm going to point out these children, very stereotypical, with glasses. I'm sorry, but I wear glasses myself, so I think I can do this without being canceled. So 3 what we call linguistically vulnerable children, and 2 linguistically proficient children wearing glasses. And now the first situation is the teacher looks up. So she's reading a story, looking at a storybook, and then she looks up to the 5 children sitting in front of her. So she says, "Oh, Jordi is lying on the ground. What could have happened?" And she looks up. So what do we see? The first important pattern we observed was that a teacher, when looking up or looking away, looking through children, she often starts and ends her gaze on the same children, which we call the steering children. We're seeing that teachers' gaze behavior is shaped by habitual patterns, routines that they themselves are often unaware of. And these children function as kind of like teachers' reference points in classrooms. But these reference points are not just any children, they tend to be the most linguistically strong, most verbally confident children in the group. So we can conclude, when looking up from reading material, teachers often begin and end at steering children in the classroom. This reference point is typically a linguistically proficient child. So a second situation, we coded every utterance, and we knew who it was directed to. If she would say, "Oh, Anne, I'm going to ask you a question," and she used the name Anne, then this was a person-oriented utterance towards Anne. But she, of course, also had group-oriented utterances. For example, "Hello to you all, today we will read a book." So let's see how she looks, or what her eye gaze does, when she uses a group-oriented utterance. What did we see? Again and again and again, when addressing the whole class without specifying who you want to involve, the teachers often unconsciously again look at the linguistically strongest child. We do not yet know why, but we do know that when teachers are not thinking about a specific child, that they look at the most proficient one. And then the third situation, the teacher asks an open-ended question. For example, why could a sports lesson be dangerous? you might have already guessed, the storybook was about a child who fell down in the sports lesson and broke his leg. So she asked, why could a sports lesson be so dangerous? She looks at the children, she keeps hanging on one specific child, and indeed that child does answer, maybe because you can fall. The teacher often initiate interactions with their gaze. And even with the linguistically strong pupils who are confident speakers, the teacher's eyes are often already on the child before they even begin to speak. So, very important to remember, it's not so that a teacher simply follows who is speaking. In 80% of the open-ended questions, the eyes from the teacher were already on the child before it started speaking. So let me quickly walk you through the most important results of our multimodal conversation analysis. First, when a teacher poses a question to the whole class, they often instinctively look at the strongest child. The teacher gaze is often already on the strongest child before they even speak. In this way, the inequity in speaking turns is unconsciously reinforced. Most interactions are initiated by the teacher's gaze, even with children who have high speaking confidence. The teacher does not simply follow whoever begins to speak. And linguistically vulnerable children rely entirely on teacher-initiated interactions. We saw that they themselves do not initiate interactions. The linguistically strong children receive more of the teacher-initiated interactions, but also initiate interactions themselves, creating an even bigger inequality. Now I'll take you through the last part of my research, but my favorite part because it allows us to listen to teachers, which I think as an educational researcher is one of the most important things to do. And here it was extra interesting, I think, because teachers were allowed to look at their own teaching through their own eyes. As you can see on the slide, they got a video recording, a point of view recording of their own teaching. And as an extra stimulus for reflection, there was this yellow dot who indicated where exactly they were looking, which was a very strong prompt for reflection because it really made teachers think about who do I see and who do I not see. And very interesting, we saw that teachers have different language beliefs for different children. For example, a teacher said, this is a big difference. So there are two groups in my class. I have the providers and I have the receivers. The providers are fully engaged in the activity. With them, you can really have a conversation. I hope they will absorb and pick up the language. And as for the receivers, the few words and bits they can grasp, if they can take those with them, that is their only hope. That's how significant the differences between these groups are. So for some children, the teachers really believed in the strength of direct interactions. Remember, on interactions that contribute to linguistic input, to opportunities for production, and to feedback. And for other children, she believes in indirect interaction, to just overhearing a conversation and maybe learning by overhearing a conversation that is going on with a different child. So then I ask myself, is this differentiation or is this a mechanism of inequity? And maybe most likely, this is both. And then another example, which showed us that expectations and bias shape teacher decisions. In the video recording, we could see that the teacher is talking, asking a question, and two children raise their hand simultaneously. But the teacher only looks at one of those children, and eventually that child starts speaking and gets engaged in a teacher-child interaction. So I, as the interviewer, ask, what makes you not look at him? Because he also has his hand raised. And the teacher replies, yes, but he's also kind of reserved. His hand is raised, but when I would say yes, he would pull a face like, what have I done? Is my hand raised? He's asking me now, and I really don't know the answer. Okay, And what makes him so reserved? Yeah, he's very sheltered in his family. In the beginning, he only came once or twice a week to school. Sometimes it's harsh for me to say this, but I feel like the parents think we have to run errands, we're going to take the little one to school. In that culture, children don't go to school until they are 7. And here in Flanders, you must go to school at 2.5. So this excerpt really shows that the expectations a teacher has on knowing the answer or not knowing the answer shapes her visual gaze behavior. And when we dig deeper from where does this expectation come from, we can see that a maybe implicit cultural bias lays on the ground of that expectation. But mostly, when we let teachers reflect on their own teaching and on those seemingly small decisions that most of the time are not even made intentionally, that these reflections, these decisions are above all very recognizable and very human. Why does a child catch our attention? Well, this child helps me move the lesson forward. I want to have a conversation, and this child will be able to realize this conversation, and then the lesson goes on. I think that's very recognizable. I don't want to put these children on the spot. I think this child doesn't know the answer, so I'm not going to look at him. I'm not going to give him a speaking turn because he might not know it and he might fail. Very recognizable. With this preschooler, I can have a rich conversation, and then the other children can learn from that rich conversation. Or this child is still being brought to school in a stroller, so he's kept small by his family, so now I'm not going to suddenly challenge him intensely. So I'm not looking at him. I'm letting him sit there in peace and quiet. Or this preschooler talks a lot and has had a lot of conversations with me, but he saves me from awkward moments of silence. Again, very recognizable and human. But also, when these small and mostly pretty unintentional decisions accumulate over time, they can lead to the situation where the same children are seen again and again, while other children are seen less and less. And in that way, these reflections do contribute to educational inequality. The central insight we can draw from this is that reflection is a forgotten yet essential component of language stimulation. Across our data, we found a clear distinction between intentional and non-intentional attention processes, as you can see on the model on the slide. And intentional and non-intentional attention processes translate into intentional and non-intentional interaction. In non-intentional interaction, a teacher is guided by the first cues that appear. The children who take the floor, who move a lot, who are enthusiastic. And I think this is something every teacher recognizes. It's automatic, intuitive, and often completely unconscious. But what we want from teachers is to use their interactional opportunities intentionally, to act from pedagogical goals, such as, I haven't heard this child yet, or with this child, I want to emphasize this vocabulary, so I'm going to start this interaction. And we know from our data, from our mixed method data in which we combined the interview study with the eye tracking study, that teachers with more depth and frequency of reflection processes had a relationship with more intentional interactions, especially toward linguistically vulnerable children. So I started this presentation by saying that interaction seems quite simple, but our research shows that this is not so simple at all. For a teacher to engage in meaningful interaction, she first needs to ask herself a number of questions. Before she interacts, what will we talk about? Which visual supports will I bring? How will I organize the group? In which area will I join to play? what language stimuli are present in each area and which vocabulary will I focus on. But maybe more importantly, after she had a conversation with a child, which preschooler did I hear and did I not hear? For which child do I have lower expectations? Why hasn't this child said anything? Did I use simpler language with certain children? So interaction is not as easy. It's not straightforward. It requires attention, awareness, and intentional decision-making. And I believe that there is only one thing that is absolutely essential for this to happen. Teacher needs time and opportunities for reflection to then, as a result, act intentionally. So in a few months, I will submit my PhD. And today, as for the first time, I want to share with you the theoretical contribution that I hope to make to the field with my research. Because I believe that our multi-method large-scale study provides strong evidence that allows us to clearly distinguish between what we can call a regular teacher competence and an equitable teacher competence, a competence that creates a more equitable learning environment for children. So I go back to the competence model that I began this presentation with. And there, noticing within that middle block of situation-specific skills, noticing suggests or is presented as a unidimensional skill. And it implicitly suggests a simple sequence. You notice something, you reason about it, you reflect about it, and as a result, you show behavior. But I think this linear view does not fully capture the reality of classroom life. As a teacher cannot not notice. A teacher is always noticing. It's the cruel fate of being a teacher. The classroom never takes a break, and you cannot simply close your eyes. So the real question becomes, what is a teacher not noticing? And within what the teacher does notice, is she making intentional decisions in her noticing? These questions shift noticing from something automatic and inevitable to something that can vary in depth, in quality, and in intentionality. What I think matters profoundly for equitable teaching. So I propose an adaptation of the model in which we define noticing as a multi-dimensional construct. In this revised model, after the initial automatic, non-intentional noticing that happens in every classroom, a teacher does engage in reasoning. A teacher reflects on his or her own practice, questioning his or her own assumptions, and examining what he or she might have overlooked. And this reflective process leads to a new and more intentional form of noticing. Noticing that is no longer driven by the most salient features in the room, not by the enthusiastic, loud, proficient children who draw learning opportunities toward themselves, but noticing that is driven by the teacher's pedagogical goals, including the goals for the children who are most linguistically vulnerable. Only then we can begin to realize, I think, or I believe, an equitable language stimulating environment for every child. I heard that there are also some practitioners here tonight, so I also want to share a practical takeaway with you, because sure, adjusting a theoretical model is nice, but what does it really change in a school? But by putting reflection and intentional decision-making at the heart of what it means to be a teacher and at the heart of what it means to create equity within education, I think we invite a different way of thinking about teachers. Let me start by focusing on professional development. If we want to make teachers more aware of their decision-making, if we want them to do things more intentionally, we actually already know what works from literature. A teacher needs to question themselves, and a teacher needs to receive a very powerful prompt to reflect. For example, video clips. Videotaping yourself and talking about it, reflecting about it jointly with your colleagues. Data literacy, making sure that you track the interactions that you have, that you keep into account who have I talked to, what learning opportunities did I create, who haven't I talked to today. Peer observation, letting a colleague visit your classroom and give feedback on who you involved and who you involved less. And reflective video-based professional development. But also another practical implication. Let me start by saying this. Mechanisms of inequity live in all of us, in our expectations, our good intentions, our biases. And I believe that's okay. But I also believe that it is the system that teachers work in that shapes the space they actually have to act. Do teachers feel like they have the time to question themselves, to reflect on their behavior, and to look at the inequities they might unintentionally reinforce? So for me, this is a very, very important final point. It's not the teacher's fault. One of the teachers in our study said something that really stayed with me. There's just not enough teacher for all of my children. And remember, the teacher-child ratio in Flemish early childhood education is 1 to 25. So what we saw happening is that teachers started to think about the children as each other's competitors for attention, for time, for support. Teachers said, do I take time for a slow conversation with a struggling child, or do I keep up with the rest of the group? So as a result, teachers are constantly forced to make choices between children. And then, of course, whenever a teacher needs to make a decision, there are opportunities for our unconscious mechanisms of inequity to slip into these decisions. Like skipping a child because a teacher feels they don't have time to slow down and wait for a less proficient child to answer. I believe it's the system that decides whether a teacher feels she has to choose between her children or not. And the system therefore decides how much room there is for biases to influence those choices. And when teachers ask for smaller class sizes, what they definitely are doing here in Flanders, then they are absolutely right. Not only because of the results of my research, but also because international studies have shown again and again that class size matters most in early childhood education. In early childhood education studies, there are more relationships found between class size and children's learning outcomes than in any other educational setting. So please remember, it's not the teacher's fault. Okay, I'm going to round off. I have said a lot. I even introduced a theoretical framework and my critics on a theoretical framework. I have no idea how common that is here. Maybe it was very weird for you guys. But let me make you feel better. For me, you can forget everything that I said, except for the next points. First, a teacher competence is more than knowledge and behavior. A teacher competence is also looking at your classroom, reflecting on your classroom, and most importantly, questioning your own behavior. A teacher's eye gaze quietly steers inequality in ECE classrooms. At least in Flanders it does. Linguistically vulnerable children are most at risk of being overlooked. Reflection and intentional noticing shape equitable teacher competencies. Reflection and intentional noticing might be the answer to the challenge we have found. And again, it's not the teacher's fault. So if you want to know more, most of our studies are already peer-reviewed and published, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Absolutely fabulous, Thibaut, thank you so much. I can see that your topic has touched a lot of our audience. I don't know if you noticed, but even while you were talking, you were getting claps, getting hearts. People were very much agreeing with, and you've got loads of claps coming in now. So I thought that everything you had to say was fascinating. I have lots and lots of questions that I could potentially ask, and I can see there is a question already in our chat. Um, but I just thought I might start with a little question, maybe something that you haven't considered. So essentially, the idea is that the children are being quiet, so they're being overlooked. Um, but at the same time, teachers may also spend more time on children who are sort of visibly or loudly struggling. I don't know, in your work, did you see any kind of a balance on that? Was there sort of more eye gaze initially on, on children who were sort of loudly struggling? Was that something you observed to begin with?
Well, I think that question goes back to the distinction we made between intentional and non-intentional interaction.
Mm,
On the basis of our interviews, we could derive whether this was a unintentional process or a intentional process. And I think it's very important to say that within the intentional processes, within the intentional interactions, teachers spend most time thinking, reflecting, and talking to the linguistically vulnerable children.
mhm,
But when we look at the totality of a classroom situation, the non intentional processes just take over. There
mm,
are just so many moments that other children start speaking, or that a teacher doesn't make an intentional decision and is just led by um, by her expectations, because those teachers know the children. They have asked one hundreds of questions to these children, and most of the times it were the same children who gave the answer. So when for the 101st time they ask this question, their attention is unconsciously drawn to that child that they know of, that they are used to, um, will answer. So yes, at that intentional level, they will definitely give attention to children who are or might be struggling, but there are just more unintentional moments than intentional ones.
yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And it knocks into kind of the next part of my question, which is the bit I thought you might not have considered, which is the aspect of sort of relationship development. So, the teacher is obviously unconsciously being drawn to the children who are communicating better. Do you think that because they communicate better over time, the teacher feels kind of more connected to them and hence they give them more of that unintentional attention?
Yes, definitely. There has been some research by a wonderful colleague of mine, Saswati Chaudhuri, who has researched the relationship between teacher-student closeness and visual attention in primary education, and she did find a relationship with teacher-student closeness. In our data, I believe that the strongest influence of teacher attention was the a teacher's need for confirmation. Some children make us feel like better teachers because they give the answer we are looking for, because they make sure that our lesson moves forward by giving an interesting answer that they can build upon, and so on. And that sense of validation is something we are all, as educational practitioners, looking for at both the intentional and unintentional level, and that draws us to certain children.
Absolutely. And actually, I noticed that Elizabeth in our chat picked up on that quote, this child helps me to take the lesson forward. I think that is such an important point. I'll come to Billy's question now in the chat. So Billy says, it's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Did you look at the children's eye gaze at all? Since we're more likely to look at those who are giving us eye contact, did you measure whether these children are prompting their responses with their sort of looking towards the teacher?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Um, of course, it's a very practical answer, but the heads of the children are much smaller than the heads of the teachers. And at the time that we started our research 3 years ago, there were not yet glasses on the market for these tiny little toddler heads. But for now, they have been. And my Finnish colleagues at Jyväskylä University have acquired them, and I'm planning to collaborate with them. I'm planning future research collaborations to also look when does a child notice something? Because I think it's a very, very, very interesting avenue for future research, because these toddlers cannot, with words, tell us very easily when do they learn, when did we catch their attention, when are they involved in the lesson. But we might learn by taking a look at their attention processes. So very interesting in for the future.
Thank you, Thibaut. If anyone else has questions, please pop them in the chat. I do have a couple more that will probably take us up to 5 o'clock, so I will just ask them. You did touch on this very briefly. You mentioned bilingual environments and such, and it just got me thinking, is the importance of sort of early language exposure and the levels and the quality, is that universal for all kinds of languages, or does it depend somewhat on the language that is being acquired?
You mean the three ingredients: language input, opportunities for production?
Yes. Does that vary at all by, for example, English is quite a complicated language, etc. Does it need more? Do other languages, are they simpler? Do they need less, etc.?
The teacher-child interactions and these threefold definition of what constitutes a qualitative interaction is universally. I briefly touched upon it. It comes out of meta-analysis again and again. Teacher-child interactions, or even uh, uh, grown-ups, I'm looking for a scientific word for grown-ups. Grown-up child interactions are very important for child language development, yes.
Okay, great. No, thank you for clarifying that. My final question is really about what you talked about at the end about implications for professional development. So it did seem to me as we went along that there was a role for sort of reflective practice, for strategizing and such. And I was just thinking specifically, your work was obviously with young children. And I feel like teachers of that age range sometimes don't have the same professional development opportunities as teachers of kind of older age ranges. So I just wondered if you thought, is this something that should be specifically taught to practitioners in that early age range to sort of make up for home environment, or should it sort of be embedded in like the wider teacher training for all teachers?
Yep.
Well, I think my answer is threefold. Maybe first of all, what I didn't have time in the presentation was that the last study of the PhD is that we again did this eye tracking experiment with the same teachers, but with an experiment and with a control group. And so the experiment group did follow a professional development initiative with reflective video-based learning, and they did show a more equal distribution of attention, and they did show more visual attention towards multilingual and children at low speaking confidence. So we actually do know it works. Is it specifically important for teachers in early childhood settings? I think yes and no. Yes, because as I said beforehand, we know that there are more opportunities for inequality because there is so much informal and yeah, in the moment learning happening, because a teacher, especially an early childhood teacher, needs to yeah, sees the opportunities that are happening in the real classroom situations that are happening there and then. A child is struggling with putting his coat on, and you use rich vocabulary to describe that coat, and you learn him that this is above and this is below when he is zipping his coat. This is a very strong learning moment, and especially in early childhood education, it is not predictable when that moment will happen, and it is an individual moment. So there are more opportunities for your unintentional processes to guide you through these learning opportunities for children. So yes, there are more opportunities for inequity, and yes, it's very important there that we help teachers build their reflection skills. On the other hand, the Blumenke model, the competence continuum model, is something that has been proven again and again in so much research, not only in early childhood education, I think especially in secondary and primary education, because early childhood education and educational studies in general is much overlooked, actually.
Mm. Fantastic, comprehensive answer. Thank you. Thank you so much for your expertise, your wonderful talk, extremely comprehensive, and for answering all of our questions, fielding some difficult answers there. I can see that our audience is wishing you all the very best for the final lap of your PhD. And I hope that this has been a good practice for you, sharing your theoretical model
Definitely.
and answering questions. So once again, thank you so much, Thibaut, and thank you to everyone for coming today. Thank you.